Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar and I'm Deputy Director of the LSE South Asia Centre here at the London School of Economics. A very warm welcome to all of you to this afternoon's event, which is the last in this term and is the next in our series of Fact and Fiction, where we choose a recently published book, invite the author and a panel of experts on the subject and have a discussion on the book. This afternoon's event focuses on the recently published Water and Development, the Troubled Economic History of the Tropics by Tirthankar Roy, who's a colleague of ours at the LSE. Here is the book. I'm delighted to show it to all of you. And we also have a brilliant and versatile panel of experts who will comment on the book, and we're all looking forward to the discussion. I am no expert on the subject, so I'm not going to say anything about the book. But before I introduce and then invite the panelists to speak, I'd like to say a warm welcome also to members of the audience who are watching us from various time zones across the world. And I wanted to mention that this event is happening via Zoom and is being live streamed on YouTube, where you are watching it. As you will see, we have just placed a comment in the comment section to show you where you can type your questions. Please do ask a question if you'd like to. You are welcome to pose a question to an individual on the panel or to the entire panel, and I will read them out verbatim at irregular intervals once the panelists have made their initial remarks. If you'd like your query to be directed to a particular panelist, then please do mention that in your query, and we will read it out accordingly. If you're the kinds who tweet and tag and those things, then please do tag us. You can see all the handles in the notes in front of you. I also wanted to say that had this event been happening on site at LSE, members of the audience at LSE have the right to ask questions without mentioning or revealing their identity. In keeping with the spirit of that position, when I read your questions, I will not be reading out your names. I'll simply read out your questions. And this is also for the information of panelists. It is now my very pleasant task to introduce today's speakers, panelists, the author. We've had a brief discussion before we came live on air, and the order in which I introduce the speakers is the order in which they will speak. The author will speak for 10 minutes, after which each panelist has about 6 to 8 minutes. And finally, the discussant will take over. Tirthankar Roy is Professor of Economic History at LSE and author of Water and Development, the Troubled Economic History of the Arid Tropics, which was published earlier this year, and is the book around which today's discussion has been organized. Dr. Leela Fernandes is a political scientist and author of Governing Water in India, Inequality, Water and the State, which was published in 2022. David Gilmartin is Professor of History at North Carolina State University and author of Blood and Water, the Indus River Basin in Modern History, which was published in 2015. Corey Ross is Professor and Director of the Institute of European Global Studies at the University of Basel and author of Liquid Empire, Water and Power in the Colonial World, which was published last year in 2024. The discussant for this afternoon is David Lewis, who is Professor of Anthropology and Development here at LSE, also a colleague of ours, and author of How Policy Forgets, Time and Memory in International Development, which is forthcoming, and the book analyzes the history of flood control in Bangladesh. Everyone, welcome to this afternoon's event. Tirthankar, please speak now. You have about 10 minutes.
Thank you, Nilanjan. My warm thanks to the South Asia Center for organizing this symposium, especially to Nilanjan and David, and to the panelists today. It's a huge privilege to have a book on water history discussed by scholars who have produced path-breaking books on water and water history over the last few years. So thank you very much for agreeing to discuss the book. My book shares with all of you in the panel the intuition that large-scale water extraction and governance has created the modern world. It's been a foundation, undergirded economic and political power. And that this process accelerated in the 20th century, though it may have begun much earlier. Now consider some facts. In the 20th century, the world's population tripled, but water use rose 6-fold. Between the 1950s and the 1980s, the amount of available fresh water used for human needs doubled. Between 1940 and 2015, per head water use in India more than doubled. Now, while statistics on water use are scarce for earlier times, there is indirect evidence that this acceleration was preceded by a longer, flatter rise that may have begun in the 1700s. Farmland, pasture, and cities grew relatively slowly for most of the Common Era and then expanded quite rapidly after 1700. Land use statistics tells us that. Now, farmland expansion on that scale requires irrigation. Cities depend on drinking water, and pastures thrived through improved water management or becoming tied more closely to irrigated farmland. Now, this story of acceleration is not very different from that of fossil fuel, which too accelerated to support economic growth, consumption growth, and we know it caused massive carbon emissions. Water extraction too has caused economic growth, but also severe environmental disruptions. We'll come to that. But the water story is distinct from carbon in at least one way. A key difference is that the acceleration in water use was centered in the tropics, not in the Western world. It originated, the big drive originated in the poorer part of the world. Climate played a very important role in shaping public action on water. More large dams and bore wells have been built in Asia, Africa, and Latin America than in the temperate north. India stands out as the global leader in the number of dams, river valley projects, and in the production of surface irrigation systems like overground drips. My book explores the relationship between water extraction and tropical development through this accent on climate, trying to understand the tropical climate to begin with. But why is water so crucial in this climate? What were the effects of acceleration in water use here? To answer questions like these, we need to understand what water extraction really means. I was trained as an economist, and economics teaches us to think of natural resources as a fixed stock, an endowment that you can measure as so much land, so much water, so much coal, so much oil, etc. Water is not a fixed stock. It is changeable, whether in the form of fluid or moist air. It flows, it varies with seasons. Its supply changes with geology, climate, and terrain. And because water is a flow, what matters to levels of living or economic growth is not the size of the endowment as much as how well the flow can be controlled. Most parts of the earth receive significant moisture influx for a part of the year. What matters for economic growth is how well societies can regulate these temporary influx to deal with deficit and excess, drought and flooding. In semi-arid and arid tropical regions, which is a very precise climatic type, and it figures on as a broad band in the middle of the globe, which contains most of the world's poor people. The problem has been especially challenging. Aridity means extreme solar heat for a long stretch of the year, broken by a short season of rain or flooding. Much of the water that comes in through these monsoon rains in India, West Africa, or annual floods as in the Nile evaporate under the heat. The challenge is to trap and recycle as much of this water as possible for use in drier seasons and drier places. Dams and reservoirs can be an answer. If these don't work, then mine water from underground. But these solutions are not cheap nor easy to implement. Societies in the past tried these solutions, as archaeologists will tell you, but usually on a regional, local scale. The modern world saw that enterprise expand on an unimaginable scale. So what happened? The acceleration did not just involve a journey from scarcity to abundance, but also from limited to greater control over influx. In hyper-arid regions like Australia or Northwest Mexico, control meant extracting groundwater where it existed and was accessible. In monsoon tropical areas like India, greater control meant dams, reservoirs, canals, and as these projects faced criticisms, bore wells. The outcome was an unprecedented rise in urbanization and agricultural productivity. But this whole process did not just mean technological change like dam and drill. Some elements of it had earlier origins, like canal networks, flood control, embankments. But the scale in which the modern world has implemented these projects, especially along river basins, required public investment for states to grow bigger and more developmentally minded. They required a construction labor market, whereas many pre-modern projects were done with coerced labor, and they required codification of the law of water use. Groundwater was mostly done with private investment, so expansion meant capitalism in water. And it entailed converting pastures. The book is about this whole complex of changes. And finally, the book is about the costs of these changes, this modernization, this acceleration. The environmental and social costs of big dams are widely discussed. They interfere with soil fertility, destroy forests, displace people. But water projects can also generate conflicts. We see this when rivers cross borders. We see this with property rights law. The default principle for allocating property rights in water is something called prior appropriation. If you were there, if you were the first to use a lake, you have a superior right. But this principle is violated time and again when settlers and migrants move into a land or when a dam changes land use from pasture to farm. For most types of groundwater, prior appropriation really doesn't make much sense because no one knows how much there is underground and how stable that is. So this is a story of the economic emergence of the tropical regions, but it's a story of a profoundly troubled emergence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tirthankar. That was less than 10 minutes, just in case you'd like to know. And I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of these issues because each one has read the book, as have I. But thank you very much for summarizing it so brilliantly, because I'm sure everyone will agree that it's not a book that can be easily summarized in such a short time. So thank you very much. Dr. Leela Fernandes is a political scientist and author of Governing Water in India, Inequality, Water and the State, which was published in 2022. Leela, please speak now. You have 6 to 8 minutes.
Yeah, thank you so much. So this is a really immense book. It's a difficult book, as you mentioned, to summarize. So I think what I will do is I will draw out a few of the overarching points which struck me, and then maybe raise 3 themes which we would want to discuss. And I'd like to hear maybe more of your reflections on, Professor Roy. So what I found really important about the book is the way in which the book shifts our understanding of development to a focus on water, away from more conventional arguments based on capitalism and particularly on the conventional view on energy. So the attempt to center economic history around water, to me itself, was an incredibly important premise and starting point and foundation for the discussion. My understanding is that key to the shift to the focus on water in the tropics is how economic growth was driven by the management of seasonality. And the need to extract, store, and recycle water is a theme which comes up, I think, at different points in the different chapters. And how the need to extract, store, and recycle water was, in fact, a key driver of population growth and development in the tropics. Again, something which is often not foregrounded enough in more conventional economic history. Now, the book is very detailed. I'm not even going to try and summarize it. It is so vast in terms of its global scope and impressive in terms of the range of regions you talk about. Also, the historical reach from the ancient time to colonial period to the 20th century developmental state to the current moment of climate change. So it's really vast, and I'm not even going to try to summarize what you have said. So I think what I'm going to do instead, and also because of constraints of time, is I'm going to just focus on 4 themes which were important to me, which I'd like to hear more thoughts on. The first is that in the course of the book, it looks like there's a changing role over time, if I'm reading reading correctly, again, I'd like to hear more thoughts about this. So it appears that in the ancient time, you kind of push back on the idea that water was linked to state building. Then the colonial period, you see the colonial state trying to take more of a role, but I think you say that it's more limited, which is in itself interesting to talk about some of the limits of what the colonial state could do. And then in the late 20th century, you see the state becoming much more aggressive, as you mentioned, through dams and other forms of economic development. And so it seems that throughout the book, the role of the state is changing in its relationship to water. And I wanted to hear you reflect more on that overarching pattern through this mass of history and global reach, which I've talked about. So more thoughts on whether that is accurate, whether you see that sort of changing and what you make of that. What are the pros and cons? Because you give us a very, I think, accurate and messy picture of some of the economic benefits and also the environmental problems and the sort of side effects of inequality which are caused. So how do you come down on the state and how the state is acting over time and in different historical periods? So that's just the first theme. The second theme is, I think that you say, one of the things I saw consistent through the book was that you say that across time, the solution is clear, that we still need to trap and recycle water. And there still needs to be a focus on extraction, regardless of what is happening. Extraction is still needed. And I wanted to find out, to hear you talk more about whether the focus on extraction, though critical, is enough, because it seems that particularly in recent decades, extraction is accompanied by transfer and the diversion of water. You address this in the books at different points when you talk about transboundary issues, and it has been relatively peaceful, but that seems to maybe be changing as droughts and floods become more intense. And I could give you a couple of examples. You see, for example, in recent years, water infrastructure has become more weaponized, not just between states, but also within nation states, as you have conflicts, for example, over sharing river resources, et cetera. And you also have transfers based on inequality. So, for example, in the Indian case, transfers now from rural areas, peri-urban areas to serve bigger metropolitan cities. So how does that sort of pattern of transference complicate the way we think about the extraction and storage of water, because it doesn't seem to be neutral from my perspective? And so do you agree with that? And what are your thoughts on that process? So that would be the second set of issues which I was interested in hearing more about. The third issue is kind of linked to that, and this would be really interesting since you're also trained as an economist. In the contemporary period, economic policies are driven by land and economic investment. That is the model of economic liberalization. And water is secondary, regardless of the focus on sustainability, the sort of lip service to water. If you look on the ground, it's really land and investment. And what you see often, for example, in my own research on India, what you see often is that bureaucrats, even within, for example, the water bureaucracy, can't really do anything because policies are based on drawing an investment. And so even if there's a situation where you have water scarcity, there's no incentive to sort of think about whether new industries are water intensive, right? So you can see that in different parts of the world where the drive for industrial investment taxes existing resources. And so water, in a sense, has become secondary to the model of economic development which we have right now. And so in some ways, this is maybe more of a philosophical question, which is, do you think we can get people to shift to think about water not as secondary? Because as you've shown, water was a driver of economic growth, but that's not how economists, policymakers, particularly also in urban planning, the field of urban planning, water is now factored in, but it's never seen as sort of primary in understanding economic growth. So what is your sense of whether we can shift that focus, in the practical realm of policymaking and urban planning in particular? So that's the third set of issues. And then finally, for the last set of issues is a big one, and you end the book with a discussion of climate change. And here I wanted to know more, because it seemed in the book that you were sort of saying that we don't have enough data about climate change. And I'm wondering if you still think that, because I'm sort of wondering whether we need data that shows sort of aggregate changes, or whether the fact that we have more extreme events of droughts and flooding, where even if you don't have multiple events, the scale of the events, which is intensifying, overwhelms states and society to such an extent that it has such devastating effects that that maybe we don't even need to wait for more data on climate change. We can already see the impact of climate change overwhelming local states, localities, bureaucracies, in the context of this sort of drive for investment and sort of economic growth, which is more city-based. So that's the fourth set of issues. So I think I will stop here. The book is really vast and immense, and I learned a lot from reading it. So I'm glad to be able to engage with you and see what you have in terms of thoughts about these issues. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Leela Fernandes. David Gilmartin is Professor of History at North Carolina State University and author of Blood and Water, the Indus River Basin in Modern History. David, please speak. Let me have 6 to 8 minutes. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Sorry. I was just saying my thanks to being invited to be on this panel, and also being given the opportunity to read the book, which I much enjoyed. And I just want to echo before I start some of what Leela said, which is that there's a huge amount of material in the book, and I found it really fascinating. And the attempt to pull together all of these different regions into a particular kind of climatic zone, and to use that as the foundation for thinking about water and development, really struck me as extremely fruitful. What I'd like to focus on actually is one question in particular, and that is the question about the relationship between geography and history that this book really raised for me. And this is, of course, rooted in the very fact that it's structured around a kind of fundamental focus on a particular type of climatic zone, which of course takes different forms in different parts of the world, as is made very clear in the book, but nevertheless is defined by certain basic realities of climate and geography. And the key point that really is emphasized over and over again is the one of not just the quantity of water available or the levels of rainfall, but of seasonality. And that what really defines the climate in these regions that are the focus of the book is that there is a significant impact from seasonality, and not just seasonality, which of course is found all over the world, but what Tirthankar, you refer to at one point in the book as extreme seasonality. That is where the differences in the terms of the amount of rainfall and the flow of rivers is really on a level that's quite different from other parts of the world. So this really provides the foundation for what the book is about. But the big question, and this is really a question, is that it seemed to me there was a bit of ambiguity in the book, which in fact on one level made it all the more interesting. But between what at various points in the book one could read as almost a kind of geographical or climatic determinism versus an attempt to really tie the specificities of climate into the quite complex interactions between climate and a whole range of other critical elements that define society. So this includes questions about the relationship of climate to the form of the state. And there is a review in the books of various people who have talked about these kinds of issues, but also fundamentally certain basic foundations of economy as well, which are tied to the way that seasonality creates structures of labor use and labor migration, for example. The way that seasonality is intertwined with the structure of the economy in a variety of different ways. The way it affects the kind of multiplicity of different sorts of endeavors that people engage in, not being confined simply to one type of economic activity, but very often to multiple ones. Not only in terms of the relationship between pastoralism and agriculture, but in terms of the kind of off-season employment, which is quite critical to the economy. And so there is this real sort of element in the book which suggests that this seasonality, though it has a question of water at its foundation, but is nevertheless one that can be understood not simply in terms of the water statistics, but in terms of the impact of this seasonality on a whole range of different social structural elements in society. And the book really does this in some very interesting ways. But having said that, one also comes back to a repeated sort of resistance to acknowledging that the fundamental drivers of what's going on go beyond simply the fundamental character of the climate, of the different forms of climatic zones that we find. So, for example, the discussion of political ecology in the book I found interesting, and it was the book was basically critical and kind of resisted an ecology which was too closely tied to politics. So there's a kind of resistance that comes up in the book more than once, and even the conclusion to the book kind of comes down to this, well, in the end, we really need to go back to these fundamentals about water and its seasonality and how a society uses water. So that's really my big question that I'd like to hear more discussion of, and just quickly to say, this relates not just to the question about geography and geographical determinism, but also the kind of historical view of how the relationship of water to society has evolved gets caught up in this as well. So I guess let me stop there, and I would be interested to hear more discussion about this.
Thank you very much, David. Our next speaker, Corey Ross, is Professor and Director of the Institute of European Global Studies at the University of Basel and author of Liquid Empire, Water and Power in the Colonial World. Corey, please take note, you have 6 to 8 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll start by repeating some of the praise that has been already lavished on the book. And as I mentioned to Tirthankar before the session began, I really wish I would have read this book before I had finished writing mine. There's so many things about it that are excellent. I think everyone has mentioned the breadth of coverage of the book, yet I have to say I think this is one of the most succinct and to the point books I have read in many years, which is greatly appreciated. It gives a clear sense of change and periodization. It is one of the key things I think it's very strong about is it's particularly coming from my field, sort of environmental history, is it's very clear-sighted on the trade-offs that are involved here. It notes the environmental and social costs of large-scale water infrastructure, all of these problems that are quite familiar, but it doesn't romanticize traditional systems. It doesn't only criticize large technical infrastructures. And this balance, this sort of hard-headedly empiric sort of balanced approach kind of opens a space to ask about whether these transformations really amount to environmental loss or social loss, or if they're just new arrangements. The book is pitched as having lessons for economic historians and development specialists, but I would suggest that it goes beyond that. I think there's lessons for others as well, including people in my fields of infrastructural history, environmental history, and probably other fields as well. I guess I'll come at it, just make a couple of just broader points from those perspectives, and then come to a few of these questions a few more questions that we could maybe discuss. Again, so I'm reading this as not someone who's really engaged with economic history per se. It plays a role in all of the work that we do, but wouldn't call myself an economic historian. But in the field of sort of environmental history, this is also in some ways an environmental history. We often talk about seasonality. We talk about it in terms of work rhythms, power, vulnerabilities, particularly with flooding or drought. What is I find really so original about this book is that it elevates seasonality from a sort of background factor to the central explanatory framework. It's almost as if it's the hinge in some of these societies. I just wonder, Professor Roy, if you would go so far as to say, this is the hinge between environment and society, environment and social organizations in these societies you're talking about. There is also a very strong sense of front-loaded benefits versus long-term deferred costs. So I'm kind of interested in this temporal question. The book seems to implicitly argue, and I wonder if you would explicitly argue for that, for a kind of long-run type of accounting for the costs of such infrastructures, rather than just indulging in development-oriented optimism. And I just wonder if there's any way that one could quantify that. But that's maybe just a side issue a bit. From an infrastructure history point of view, this has it's quite a contribution, and the big contribution is, I think, the emphasis, and rightful emphasis in my view, on finance. It's not just about state power, technology, and engineering, the usual suspects. And to an extent, I wonder, Professor Roy, if you would almost treat financing here as a form of infrastructure itself when it comes to water control. By that I mean almost an infrastructure that pre-commits or conditions societies to certain types of technologies or arrangements when it comes to extracting water and controlling it. I think as well that another very strong point from an infrastructure perspective is that development in these arid tropical areas, you make it very clear that this is not so much water driven as storage driven, which actually sounds like a minor issue, but I think it isn't when one really thinks about what the conceptual shift is, because it kind of it helps. It's a very interesting mechanism for reconciling these dissonances between environmental time, seasonality on the one hand, and economic time, production cycles on the other. So those just by way of some comments, but this leads me to a few questions. I shared a couple of Leela's questions, so I won't repeat them, and the geography and history, the environmental determinism question was always going to come up, so I won't repeat that either. One question is sort of the linearity of causality sometimes. The book is very, very good on the environmental costs of this water-based development, but it is kind of linear, runs from sort of, intervention leads to consequences. And I guess I was just wondering, sometimes it didn't really feel so much missing as maybe, I just wonder how important a role you think it has to play if one thinks about, feedback loops a little bit more, how far environmental degradation is then shaping further political decisions that then shape the forms of environmental intervention and degradation that happen after that. Perhaps you might argue that given the long timescales involved, we don't know enough yet. But that would be one interesting question to think about. I mean, is there a way in which we can think of this causality in a little bit more of a circular way? That would be one thing. An obvious point, and forgive me for raising this, an environmental historian is bound to do this. There's been a lot of recent work that really emphasizes non-human agency. And this book is resolutely anthropocentric in that sense, and that is absolutely fine. I think it should be. But I just wonder how far you would actually thinking about causality and relative importance, prioritization of factors here, how far you actually would consider, how far you do in fact already consider water or its absence as a kind of economic agent here. Perhaps more to the point, linking a bit with something that Leela said. Many of the interventions you're talking about are state-led. Much of the infrastructure is state-led. And I think that's well justified in many ways. But increasingly, NGOs are involved in water infrastructure. Communities can become a bit more involved in infrastructure. And there's also sort of market-based, market actors becoming involved in infrastructure. They're all becoming more present actors in this space. And I just wonder, in terms of the lessons we might distill from this history for current practice, what happens if, how would the analysis or some of the conclusions change if the state were slightly less central, if we decenter the state and bring those actors in a little bit? And that leads me finally to a couple of other points I'll go through very quickly, a couple of questions about what history means for the present, because it's not often that I read a book that I think has such important things to say about the present. And one, of course, is who wins and who loses. The book rightly stresses distributional outcomes. But are there specific institutional reforms, whether it's tenure or water pricing or whatever, that you would imply or favor as remedies, is redistribution just too much to ask for? Another point is technocracy and local knowledge. This is a constant theme in histories of this on water, and you critique technocratic large-scale projects displacing local practices to an extent, but not without, as I mentioned, without romanticizing the latter. But for development practitioners, and I'm not one of them, I'm just wondering, is there a lesson here to draw about the right balance between expert planning and local institutions? Are there concrete institutional designs that might come out of this history? And a final point is sustainability trade-offs, because given this account of environmental stress, how should present-day climate and development policy incorporate those lessons? Does the book suggest different infrastructure priorities, groundwater recharge or decentralized storage, for instance? Does the historical evidence support these shifts? So I hope I haven't gone too far over time, but there's just so much, a testament to the richness of the book, if I have.
Thank you so much. That was great. Before I move on, I just wanted to say once again to those who are watching the event online that you're very welcome to ask questions. Please use the chat box function, which is enabled to ask questions. You can ask a question to an individual panelist or to the entire panel, and we will pose it in due course at irregular intervals. Now, Tirthankar, I've been making a list of all the things that have been hurled at you, and I have no doubt you have been as well. But it might be just useful if we hear David Lewis speak, and then maybe you can come in and respond briefly, and then we can carry. Does that sound all right to you? Okay, great. Our discussant for this afternoon is David Lewis, who is Professor of Anthropology and Development here at the London School of Economics and author of How Policy Forgets: Time and Memory in International Development, which is forthcoming, and analyzes the history of flood control in Bangladesh. David, please speak now.
Thank you, and thanks to all of the presenters who have pretty much covered much of what I was going to say, but it just makes me realize what a rich discussion we have before us. I'd like to thank Nilanjan and the South Asia Centre for the opportunity to participate in this fascinating and timely discussion. And I think it's really timely because, as we started briefly talking about before the session began, Tirthankar's book, Water and Development, joins what seems to be an outpouring of work, if you forgive the phrase, of different kinds of work that's picking up on the importance of water, of rivers, of floods, as a way into thinking about the present. There's been a real surge of interest recently in water, and including from a historical perspective, but also more widely in the social sciences and in popular writing too. And I'm thinking, for example, of Robert Macfarlane's book "Is a River Alive?", which has attracted a huge amount of attention. James Scott's "In Praise of Floods," Jason Kahn's "Delta Futures," and Iftikhar Iqbal's "The Range of the River," just coming out now, I think, or recently out. So I think this is a remarkably timely, erudite, thought-provoking, and as everybody has said, incredibly wide-ranging book. And I guess as someone who does research on development, I guess most of my comments are going to be directed at the development dimension of the book. There are others here who have much more of a sense of the historical dimension. But one of the aspects of the book that I found really interesting and illuminating was the powerful way that it redirects us towards a water-centered view of development. And there are so many examples in the book that show how this opens up new insights and thinking in ways that are not always obvious. And one that I recognize from my own work in Bangladesh that Tirthankar mentions is the idea of sort of small scale irrigation, this kind of under the radar water access that has played such a large role in Bangladesh's development, but is one that's largely invisible if one looks at the policy discourses focused on the much higher profile aspects of deep tube wells, dams, large scale water control infrastructure. But it also, I think, draws attention to some of the unintended consequences of development that happen in the context of water. And I'm thinking of the recent problem of arsenic in groundwater in parts of the Indian subcontinent that was a completely unintended outcome. So I think this water-centered view of development is tremendously powerful. The second question I wanted to raise that the book highlights is this idea that we may have paid too much attention to explanations of development that focus on the economy, on markets, on the adverse incorporation of parts of the world into the global economy. And I think already mentioned was these questions of geographical determinism, arguments that have to some extent fallen out of favor, but it would be good to know how far this geographical determinist argument is the central one that Tirthankar wants to make here, and if so, how water plays a role in today's patterns of global market integration, and how water is becoming the focus of both privatization and also speculation. And I'd be interested in more thoughts on that. The points about seasonality, I think, are also tremendously important for development. It's always been an issue that's been discussed in relation to agriculture, of course, and sort of rurality. But I think the book moves us beyond that into new ways of thinking about the centrality of seasonality. And I think it also, seasonality, as has been mentioned, requires us to reflect on issues of time. And I think one of the thoughts that the book set in motion in my mind was the idea of the extent to which thinking about water leads us to consider the role of time in development, not just in terms of short-term thinking versus long-term thinking, but also in terms of industrial time, agricultural time, and the idea that development is essentially about trying to reconcile different temporalities, trying to manage those different temporalities. So then, finally, I think my final point is around the focus of the book seems to me to be primarily on seeing development as economic growth. And it's quite an economistic view of development. And I'd be interested to know more about how far the hydraulic dimension also tells us about other dimensions of development, the social, the political. There's already a lot in there about the environmental dimensions of development, but those are the thoughts and the questions that the book prompted in me to add to what's already been said. So I think I'm handing over now to Tirthankar to respond to an incredibly long list of questions and comments.
Great, thank you very much, David. Tirthankar, shall we give you 10-ish minutes and you keep, there are a list of questions.
Yes.
So even if you can touch upon them briefly and then we can have a conversation around it. But
yes, indeed.
Because there are quite a few pointed questions as well.
Yes, indeed. I'm not going to pretend to be able to do justice to the number of things that came up. I mean, I see it as a sort of open agenda, and there's a great deal that I don't know. And the book really builds on quite substantial ignorance about this history. So it's trying to do something, but I cannot claim that it's been very successful. But it certainly enables asking certain questions about the relationship between water and long-term development, and I think that's based on the feedback I have received from experts in this field. It seems that the book has been somewhat successful in doing that. But let me pick just a few points from what has come up so far, and some of the bigger ones. One of this is the point that Leela raised very early on is about the role of the state in the long run. Most archaeological sites, I mean, it'll be wonderful to have a connected history of older projects and newer projects, and to see how the state or power is involved here. Now, for most archaeological sites, the evidence that you have about who built them is really about kings, warlords, communities, not about the bureaucracy, the bureaucracy that you talk about, Leela, in your book. Now, these two things are separate. And what we lack here is a really systematic history of the bureaucratic capacity of states, how projects are not just built, but how they are sustained, how they mobilize labor, and how they mobilize capital, and why some of them fail or collapse. I think a great deal of the archaeological evidence is very open to different interpretations of that question. And ideally, we would like a fuller history of the bureaucratic capacity of states, especially in the tropical regions. I think you raise an excellent point about conflicts. One general thing we need to keep in mind, and that kind of addresses several other points that came up in this discussion, is the big difference between surface water projects and groundwater. Surface water projects typically involve river basins and big rivers which can which delivers you enough water to trap. But surface water, but that sort of projects, the river-based projects, have always involved state capital, always involved big ways of thinking about development. And while the dam drive has had kind of subsided for some time for exactly some of the questions that came up during the discussion, the adverse changes in landscape. But it is coming back again. That way of thinking about transforming rivers to create provisions for the future is something that has come back in the world, present day world, in a very big way. I mean, some of the world's biggest dams are under construction in China and Ethiopia and elsewhere. So on that level, river water recycling, the world really hasn't moved away very much. It keeps coming back to the same kind of vision for the future, and that almost always involves state and bureaucratic capacity. Groundwater is a completely different story. It is capitalism, it is private investment, it's about regulation by law, not by big capital and big states. The conflicts are also of a very different nature in groundwater. And one of the fundamental things, of course, is that we don't know how much there is. And even where we know there is an aquifer, it may be so deep underground, or the layer of rocks are so hard to penetrate that you cannot get access to it. There are aquifers under the Sahara, but most of it is not accessible. So there are different kind of questions about groundwater. So I think we have to understand that the nature of the conflicts, the way states think about water, the way societies think about water differ quite systematically between these two types of resource. On climate change, I mean, that point came up on several occasions. I think Corey mentioned it, Leela mentioned it. This is a very interesting subject. I mean, what is going to change in the story that I told in the book? What is going to change if there is global warming? And there is, well, to start with, I mean, I think the IPCC reports in the around early 2000s made this a kind of central theme. And after that, since then, I can count about 12 major journals that appeared, which published studies, local studies about what is going to happen to water when if temperatures change. It's a difficult question to answer because you cannot answer it with past data because the parameters have changed. But so you need to do quite a lot of simulations to answer this question. But if you collect a random selection of maybe 50 articles published in these journals, what you do observe is this theme that keeps popping up, which is that seasonality is going to get worse. Dry seasons will become drier, wet seasons will become wetter. What is not very clear is whether the total available water for human use, not just drinking, but also as an input into production, whether that's going to change. Because that depends on quite a few variables on which we know too little. And one of them is groundwater recharge. How climate is going to affect that. And the second one is snowmelt, the big snowpacks. I mean, how they're going to, how much extra water is going to get added, and how stable will be the flow if a bit of Himalayas melts, and of course it's going to melt. And there are other questions as well. I mean, how deforestation and other human action might feed back into water water seasonality. So overall, I don't think that this literature is yet at a stage where it can say that the pattern of economic change, which depends on recycling excess water towards dry places and dry seasons, how that enterprise is going to be shaped by climate change, whether that's going to be fundamentally a different kind of enterprise. I mean, the evidence doesn't suggest that it's going to be that way. You are absolutely right that the risks will increase, but that's a separate problem from the long-term pattern of economic growth, which depends on seasonal recycling of water. I think I'll just tackle just one more question, and I'm aware that there are quite a few things that I'm leaving out here, but um, I have to say something something about climatic determinism. Um, if you have the sense from the book that there is a kind of a deterministic approach here, that climate matters above everything else, and that it explains a lot, I don't dispute that. I think, without quite intending it that way, that accent, maybe an excessive accent, is part of what I'm doing here. I don't justify it. I don't defend myself, but it's inevitable because my field, economic history, talks about geography in a very ad hoc way, and almost anywhere I see. In environmental, and not so much environmental history, but but political ecology particularly. The I mean, geography. I mean, there is a kind of deliberate suggestion that geography matters less than politics. I mean, it's quite explicit that politics matters above all. So I think in some way there is a reaction, a response to those perspectives, to say that, well, we have to do a better job with water. I mean, we have to bring climate back in, and doing that, and this is one way of doing that. I'm not saying that this is the best way of doing that, but I think there is a sort of intellectual agenda here, which is to emphasize how climate can be reintegrated in our understanding of long-term development. So that might certainly look like an overemphasis on the climatic aspects. But once again, I mean, I think I'll end my response to this by saying how much we don't know about this history. And I think any effective book should actually, well, suggest what where this field can move in next. And there are quite a few ideas that came up from the discussion so far along that line. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tirthankar. David, did you want to say something? David Lewis, sorry, you.
I wasn't specific. I was going to ask whether any of the others wanted to respond to the responses. I mean, one of the things that I wanted to ask a little bit more about, and I think you touch on it briefly in the book, around what we can learn from thinking more about seasonal scarcity in the tropics to help us prepare for and address growing water problems today. And I think you talk a little bit about water conservation technologies and water trade and those kind of issues, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on that.
Can I respond to that very quickly? I mean, I'm glad that you bring it up, because I think one of the quite fundamental things that Corey raised is this concept of seasonality, and what are the prospects of building history based on this one idea. I think well, one of the things that that's good about seasonality is that you can actually measure it I mean, there are measures of seasonality, but precipitation seasonality, that is how concentrated rainfalls are. And if you combine that with extreme temperature data, then you get a very good sense of what kind of climatic zone we are talking about. And you can see that the temperate is a very different zone, because the precipitation seasonality is much more even there. and temperatures are lower. I mean, you also can then go to the equatorial zones, and you get a different kind of geographical climatic conditions there. So these are measurable indices, and I think that's one of the good things about using it, that you can actually show how much. But yeah, well, once again, I think the response to this seasonality has been immensely varied, and I think the way the states think is in terms of using these big bodies of rivers, big bodies of water, and the way the communities think are smaller bodies of water, and also conservation. So this is the other point that Corey raised a little while ago, which is about looking away from the state and looking at communities, looking at regions, looking at more local enterprise, and see how the story changes. And I think that's a really wonderful agenda. The book doesn't do that very much, but it's if I were to write another book on this subject, then that might be one of the things that I would like to understand much better. Now, the problem here is that you have a tremendous range of things going on. As Corey mentioned, I mean, there are things are not looking up to the state all the time. I mean, there are changes happening everywhere all the time, and big changes are happening with desalination technology, with groundwater recharge, with overground drips, with conservation, and also with local cooperative solutions to water conservation. That started from a very long time ago, but it became quite central to development studies with in the 1980s, and subsequent to that, a lot of political ecology and other ecological studies have focused on this type of enterprise. I'm not saying that they don't matter, but the measure of how much they matter in the aggregate are missing. So we know that they matter for regions. They certainly do. I mean, many of my former associates in India have been working on watershed management and very significant work there. So there's no question that they are very significant locally. But can they actually change the way states think about water security? I don't think that we have got to that stage. States think like states, and they think in terms of huge water bodies that can be transformed, how to transform the landscape over hundreds of thousands of kilometers. I mean, that's the way states think, and that thought is not going to go away. It's part of, I mean, states think of not just managing a local problem, but they think about securing the future and making a statement, securing the future against all sorts of threats and sustainability issues, sustaining economic growth. States plan, and the element of the planning in terms of water has always been big bodies of inflow that you can transform, that you can control. So that part of the story is certainly not going away. I mean, it will be with us, because that's what development means for many political administrators.
Leela, would you agree with this idea of the state, given you deal with the state so extensively?
Yes, I do. I think that's a really important point, just as the point that you made, Professor Roy, about the turn back to big dams, I think is also illustrative. I'm just kind of thinking as you speak, sort of in terms of what I've seen about groundwater management in the areas I worked in India, is that the states are using that sort of mentality even to think about groundwater, in terms of like large scale transfers. And I think for me, the thing that I worry about, just in terms of like the worries that come up in terms of the research, is their underlying structural imbalances. States think in these particular kinds of ways, and these lead to transfers. And so even if you have enough quantity of water, quantity is not really the problem. It's the imbalances, the structural imbalances, which have been built up over time versus the imbalanced ways in which states think, which are then get layered on to the imbalances of climate that get more extreme. And so for me, it's those layers of imbalances and what that means for our future. And I think what is important about the book, to go back to the importance of the book, is trying to get economists and policymakers to foreground water. Can we keep pressing that, because it is so critical right now, because it is so secondary in terms of the drive. And one of the things which I've been grappling with is that there's almost like a disconnect between the debates on economic policy and the debates on climate change. It's almost like climate change is in the sphere of the spectacle and the natural, which states are then trying to grapple with. And then on the split side, they're working on these economic, the sort of like driver of economic policies. And we're not bringing those together in practical ways, when in fact, you can't dislocate those. And that's part of also the bifurcated ways in which states think, as well as the sort of the control part, which I completely agree with. So I'm just sort of talking off the top of my head, but it's because the discussion is provoking a lot of interesting thoughts.
Corey, did you want to come back on anything? Though I was going to say to Tirthankar that I was also a bit keen to hear if you had anything to say about the point Corey made about non-human agency.
Yes. Well, first of all, I'd ask Corey to spell that out a little bit more fully.
Well, I mean, at a very simple level, it's just, the extent to which you would obviously not imbue water with a sense of intentionality or anything like that, but just in a sort of, actor network type of way of thinking, whether you would attribute to it, a similar kind of level of importance as an actant in a Latourian sense as you would to human endeavors to control it. I guess one could think about that as weather anomalies, or you could think about it as a flood. But it's just something that we always like to pose the question to an extent. It's an inevitable question whenever you say anything to an environmentalist historian, especially when you're making such a strong case. And I think I'm quite attracted to your forthright defense that yes, I'm making the climate here quite a determining factor. I think insofar as we have climatic determinism, there's better and worse versions. This is really one of the stronger cases I've seen for having explanatory power for long run economic development for certain parts of the world. So kudos from that point of view.
Thank you very much. Can I quickly respond to this point? Well, thank you very much. I think that was the idea that big frameworks for understanding long-term change, which is either uncertain about climate or doesn't know how to bring it in. I think the book is really making a point there that you have a map of the world created by geographers of climate, and you have to bring that in some fashion. And this is one way of doing it. In terms of non-human agency, and going back to climate again, I think that's a very important point. But then, any geographical description of the tropical monsoon climate that you read will tell you that there are huge unknowns here. One massive unknown is how the intertropical convergence zone behaves from year to year. We don't know that. I mean, there are ways of tracking that, but the statistical models are not perfect, and they're already beginning to change because there are other ways of forecasting climate, more through pattern recognition, more AI. That's a massive area that we don't understand very well. Whether we know that May will be hot, but how hot, we don't know that. We know that in the Northern Hemisphere, July will bring some rain, but we never know whether the next year will be a really good rain year. We are getting better at that, but we are nowhere near perfectly predicting that. So the risk of drought and flooding, which is ingrained in this kind of climatic condition, that remains. I mean, you cannot completely deal with that with prior knowledge, and that remains. So, and of course, climate change could change some of these parameters. Of course, that's another big unknown. So that's a kind of partial response to your question.
David Gilmartin. Sorry,
Yeah.
we have two panelists who have David as their first name and one who has David as his second name, so I have to keep saying the full names. So, David Gilmartin, did you want to respond to what Tirthankar had to say about lack of historical data of a certain sort, because you made the point about geography and history?
Yeah, well, I mean, it comes back to this question that you were just talking about, and I thought your answer about, well, there is some geographic determinism built into this, climatic determinism, and there it is, kind of tracks very much with the sense I got in the book, which was that you were ambiguous about this. You know, it was there, but you didn't want to kind of turn that into the absolute sort of central argument. But I thought this question that's been raised, I think Corey raised it, about the temporal character of this, about economic time versus a kind of climatic time, is a really interesting question. And the book is really kind of very suggestive in this way, but again, maybe not completely focusing in on it, because I mean, the seasonality is so central to the whole discussion of water, and it's kind of irreducible. The seasonality of water on Earth is never going to go away. I mean, it's built into the entire structure of the global climate. But yet, at the same time, what you're kind of describing here is seasonality also as being a problem, and that the history of the question of water and its connection to development is tied fundamentally to trying to mitigate this seasonality, you know, through water storage, through mechanisms by which water can be used to, in a way, kind of take society away from this climatic time, if one wants to use that phrase, seasonal time, toward a more kind of economic time. But yet, I mean, the question I guess I would like to ask after your comment is, you know, that seems like on one level it's a pipe dream, right? I mean, I absolutely take your argument, which is really well presented, about that this is critical to development to face this head on. And that's where this kind of climatic foundation, climatic zone foundation is so important. But having said that, you know, this seasonality can never be completely controlled. That's just that's fundamental to the structure of nature, right? I mean, so I'm wondering if that's kind of, you know, a tension that you yourself encountered as you were writing the book.
I'm not sure that I was quite aware of this, but now that you mention it as a reaction to the book, I see the point here. There are quite a few things that are coming up. I can see that these are structures, these are ways of thinking about this problem overall. I mean, both problem from a historical perspective and also problem from a developmental perspective. The point about temporality is a very important one. I think David Lewis first raised it, and it is a very important one. I think David also raised this problem of understanding development in terms of water, and there are these constructions of multidimensional development indices, which I'm sure factors in water in some way. The one thing about water that we haven't discussed, but which does figure in the book to some extent, is that the quality of water matters to disease and epidemic incidence. So there are a variety of ways that these things come in, and I think all of them kind of boils down to this idea that well, seasonality you kind of control, but its effects are well, they are amenable to change, but the instruments are very costly, and costly for societies as well as for states, and possibly costly for sustainability in the future. So I think that's the broad message, and I think I'll stand by that.
David Lewis, did I think you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to, well, I wanted to pick up something related on the earlier climate change discussion, because I wanted to push you a little bit more, Tirthankar, where you say that thinking about climate change and thinking about the, what you call the kind of moralizing, solutions around consuming less, that those don't apply to water, or at least it's more complicated to think about applying them to water consumption. And I just wondered if that's true. I mean, I just think, there are ways in which you can appeal to using less water, and there is plenty of research into crops, varieties that are, reducing the amount of water that's needed. There are technologies around, using less water, reusing water. So I think, I would say there is a case for trying to build water much more strongly into climate adaptation policies and into adaptation thinking, that your book very usefully supports and kind of propels into the mainstream, where to some extent it's not there. And I think perhaps there is a moralizing element to what you're showing, and that perhaps you shouldn't step back from it in the way that you do.
I completely agree. I mean, I don't argue with that. I think it's partly a question of campaigning based on a variety, maybe thousands of local level initiatives which use water more sensibly, and then building up from these cases to a macro argument about what can you do and what you can support. No, that's absolutely acceptable. I mean, the two things about climate change, well, one thing about climate change that puzzles me coming from India is how little it drives people emotionally. Unlike in the Western world, where there are really significant, very powerful public campaigns around it. I'm not saying that they don't exist in India, but they have nothing like the emotive appeal that this issue has in Britain, for example. And it always puzzled me why. But then you go to South India and you see that water takes that role. So clearly, much more than carbon emissions, it's water use which drives the tropical world. And that has been on my mind to some extent when I think about the politics around use of resources.
Corey, did you want to say something?
If I could just, sorry, this is a historiographic question, but I just wonder very quickly, Tirthankar, how you would answer. And one is sort of economics. You're taking quite, I wonder, it seems to me that you're taking quite a swipe at certain areas of economics and economic history. There's recently been, of course, as we all know, a Nobel Prize for very institutionalist kinds of approaches to understanding wealth and poverty in the world, and you seem to be really throwing a spanner in that works. And I just sort of wondered why that wasn't a bit more prominent in the introduction, or how you're framing the book. And the other was with response to sort of a global history side of things. as well. And that's the sort of, old 25-year-old big debates about the Great Divergence now. And again, you seem to be throwing a new spanner into the works of those old arguments as well. And I just sort of, wondered where you see the contribution being here, or if you just wanted to sort of stay away from those debates in the first instance, and if so, why?
I mean, you raised some really interesting ways that, that the way I started this project and why. Well, first of all, strategically, I didn't want to get too deep into comparative economic growth discussions, because that's not quite the purpose for the book. But what I say in the book in relation to comparative growth and the broad critique, which is very summarily done because I had other things to do in the book, is that the way the field understands economic growth, comparative growth, which is to study the Western world, see what changed there, and then see what is missing in the rest of the world. That's not a very good way of understanding it, because then you are missing out what the rest of the world is really about. And so there is another way of doing this history, which is to understand the rest of the world first and what problems they have to overcome, and then get back to comparative growth. So that's really drove the entry point into this subject. I mean, as far as comparative economic growth goes, but there are of course other entry points, which is climate map.
Thank you, Tirthankar. I'm conscious of time, and since we don't have any questions from members of the audience, unless there is someone who wants to say anything by way of closing remarks, any of the panelists, or Tirthankar, you yourself, is there something you'd like to say?
You had a question, Nilanjan.
I had a question that was actually related to David Gilmartin and what he was saying, because I suppose that exposes the fact that both of us are trained as historians, but that actually had to do with, what we identify as geohistorical structuralism, the Brodelian framework. And when David Gilmartin was asking you questions, making the point about geography and history, etc., and geographical determinism and the historical view of, it's the whole question is one of view in a certain context. And having read your book, my question was actually that, as historians, we will always struggle with, and you are not entirely immune from being a historian yourself. As historians, we will always struggle with having dotted and patchy bits of evidence. I mean, that is the challenge as well as the beauty of our discipline, is that we are never able to create uninterrupted narratives. There will always be these gaps. But with what we have, and while I see the point you were making in response to what Leela said, that there's really is only that much we know about archaeological sites and etc. I did wonder whether it was possible, you thought at any point, because your book also does so much else, that actually the geography history connection is one element of it. Whether you thought at any point that more could be done about it, were you to be focusing particularly on the historical evolution coming on to the present, because we're all agreed and we've kind of made our peace with the fact that as we come forward in time, it becomes easier to narrativize because there's more evidence. And I just wondered, because I did, and that's why I began with giving you the Brodel example, is because of, I was very taken when I was reading your book about how your book actually functions in multiple frames at the same time. And in different chapters, there is a prominence to one frame over another. And as it progresses, it becomes increasingly rich. But my question was actually connected to what David Gilmartin was saying. If you'd like to say something in response, that's absolutely fine, but you don't owe me an answer.
No, I think that's a wonderful question, and that's really quite fundamental. I think no, you're absolutely right. I mean, we, of course, any historical project will have to deal with patchy data, uneven data at all times. That's standard, that's universal. But I think one way to address that would be to connect different types of evidence, as many as you can, and a geographical history. I mean, where you start from geography and then go back to economic or developmental problem, allows you to do that in very creative ways. I'm not saying that my book is the best way of doing it. I think Corey's book, Liquid Empire, does that as well. Many environmental histories do that. But what it allows you to do is to bring in what are discrete bodies of research, scholarship, into a connection, into a connection which speaks to economic history or developmental or the history of economic development. And these parts are really quite an amazing range. Of course, archaeological evidence on water, yes, there's a lot that we don't know. But here is a subject where you can actually bring that in, the archaeology in. Here is a subject where you can bring famine history in. Here is a subject where you can bring climate change research in. So I see my work as allowing different kinds of discrete scholarships to come in and have a conversation.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much, all of you. I think this is a good point at which we end this conversation. For those who watch or have watched any of our earlier events online will know that I always end all these online events by saying that if there's anything good that came out of the COVID pandemic, it is that we all became tech savvy and learned how to use Zoom. And it allows us to convene these kinds of literally global international panels. But it is equally true that we can't do it unless each of you and all of you give so freely of your time and your expertise so that we can have these kinds of conversations. So thank you very much, Leela Fernandes, David Gilmartin, Corey Ross, David Lewis, and of course, Tirthankar. This is the last event in our term. I'm somewhat relieved to say, but we'll be back with a completely new calendar and term full of events at the end of January. Goodbye.
Goodbye. And